Picture this, if you will, a city of pure white marble rising from the swamps of Chicago's lakefront, its alabaster palaces glowing like something conjured from a fever dream, its lagoons reflecting hundreds of electric lights that transformed night into day for the first time in human history, its gilded domes catching the sun as over 27 million souls, nearly half the population of the United States, poured through its gates during just 6 months in 1893, believing they had glimpsed paradise itself, believing they stood at the threshold of a new golden age where art and industry would unite to lift humanity toward perfection, but what they couldn't see, what they weren't meant to see, was the darker truth hiding behind those gleaming white facades, that every magnificent building was constructed not of marble at all but of a cheap theatrical substance called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber painted white and stretched over wooden frames, that the whole spectacle was designed from its inception to be temporary, ephemeral as smoke, destined to vanish within months, and that its creation would break not just budgets but human bodies and spirits, bankrupting the very men who dreamed it into being, leaving behind not monuments but ghosts, and that this so-called White City, this world's Columbian exposition celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in America, would haunt American architecture and urban planning for generations, casting what one prescient architect called a white cloud whose shadow would darken the nation's creative spirit for half a century. The story truly begins not in triumph but in tragedy, in a Chicago hotel room in January 1891, where John Wellborn Root, the brilliant 41-year-old architect who had co-designed the fair's layout and who many considered the most gifted designer of his generation, lay dying of pneumonia after returning from a business trip to Atlanta. His fevered mind perhaps still racing with visions of the impossible city he and his partner Daniel Burnham had been tasked with creating, and as Root drew his final labored breaths on January 15, 1891, the entire architectural establishment of Chicago went into shock, newspapers proclaiming that the city had lost not just an architect but its most distinguished designing architect, and Burnham, now suddenly alone, faced the crushing weight of building the largest architectural undertaking in American history without the creative genius who had conceived its essential character, the man who had argued passionately that the fair should showcase a distinctly American architectural voice, something organic and original that would announce to the world that the United States had finally come of age culturally, no longer needing to borrow the aesthetic languages of Europe. But Root was gone, and in his absence, Burnham made a fateful decision that would echo through the decades. He invited the old guard of American architecture, trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition of Paris, steeped in the classical vocabulary of ancient Rome and Renaissance Italy, to design the fair's major buildings, and these men, including the formidable Richard Morris Hunt, Charles McKim, and others from the Eastern architectural establishment, descended upon Chicago with a singular vision of neoclassical grandeur that would have made Caesar weep with recognition, and they chose Jackson Park, a desolate, swampy wasteland on Chicago's South Lakefront, as their canvas, 630 acres of marshland and sand dunes that landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, already famous for designing New York's Central Park, would have to transform through sheer force of will and an army of laborers into something resembling the gardens of Versailles. Now here's where the human cost begins to reveal itself, where the fairy tale starts showing its fangs. Constructing this temporary fantasy city required a massive, largely immigrant workforce, Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, Polish carpenters, men desperate for work in a city already teetering on the edge of economic disaster, and these workers, whose names have largely been erased from the official histories, toiled through brutal Chicago winters and sweltering summers, wading through freezing water to drive pilings into the unstable lakefront soil, mixing and applying ton after ton of that theatrical, staff, material, sculpting it into cornices and capitals and caryatids that from a distance looked like centuries-old stonework but up close revealed themselves as little more than painted papier-mâché, and the official medical bureau of the Columbian Exposition would later report only 32 deaths during construction, but this number is almost certainly a grotesque underestimate, as it doesn't account for workers who died weeks later from injuries, for those who simply disappeared from the rolls, for the immigrants whose deaths went unreported because they had no papers, no families to claim them, no power to demand an investigation, and labor historians now believe the real death toll may have been several times higher, with scores more permanently maimed or crippled, their bodies sacrificed on the altar of architectural ambition, their suffering invisible to the millions who would later walk through the gleaming gates and marvel at the beauty that their blood and sweat had created. The scale of the undertaking was simply staggering, almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Over 200 buildings had to be designed, engineered, and constructed in just 3 years, 14 main exhibition halls including the manufacturers building, which at that moment was the largest enclosed space ever built by human hands, covering 44 acres under a single roof. A structure so vast that visitors reported feeling dizzy trying to comprehend its dimensions. And then there was the machinery. Building with its revolutionary steel arches spanning 368 feet, the electricity building showcasing the new power of alternating current that would soon transform every aspect of modern life, the agriculture building displaying the bounty of American farms at the precise moment when those farms were failing by the thousands due to the economic depression, the transportation building designed by Louis Sullivan with his radical, golden door, that broke from the monotonous white classicism of the other structures and whispered hints of a more organic American architecture that might have been, had Root lived, had different choices been made, had the conservative forces of European classicism not won the aesthetic battle, and of course the towering Ferris wheel, 264 feet tall, designed by engineer George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. as America's answer to the Eiffel Tower that had stunned visitors at the Paris Exposition just 4 years earlier, a wheel that could carry 2,160 passengers at once in its 36 wooden cars, each the size of a bus, rotating slowly to give riders a bird's-eye view of the white city spread below them like a hallucination of order and beauty, like a vision of what America could become if only it surrendered to order, hierarchy, and classical European aesthetics. But even as this dream city took shape, even as the plaster dried and the electric lights were wired and the lagoons were filled with water pumped from Lake Michigan, a darker reality was closing in like a storm front over the prairie. On February 20, 1893, just 2 months before the fair's scheduled opening, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt, triggering a financial panic that would metastasize into one of the worst economic depressions in American history, the Panic of 1893. And within weeks, banks were failing across the country at an alarming rate, the stock market collapsed in a spiral of fear and selling, businesses shuttered their doors never to reopen, unemployment soared above 20% in many cities, soup lines formed, families lost their homes, life savings evaporated overnight, and suddenly Chicago found itself hosting a celebration of American progress and prosperity at the precise moment when millions of Americans were losing their jobs, their savings, their homes, their faith in the very economic system the fair was meant to glorify, and this cognitive dissonance, this gap between the fair's glittering promise and the nation's grim reality, would haunt the exposition throughout its run, creating an eerie sense that the White City was not a preview of the future but rather an escape from the present, a fantasy more akin to opium than prophecy. The fair opened on May 1, 1893, with President Grover Cleveland pressing a golden telegraph key that sent an electric signal to unfurl flags and start the fountains, but the crowds that first day were thin, anxious, unsure whether to celebrate or mourn, many having traveled to Chicago on their last dollars, hoping the fair would offer some relief from their economic troubles, some sign that better times were coming, and it would take weeks before attendance picked up as word spread through newspapers and word of mouth of the fair's genuine wonders, the first Ferris wheel that lifted passengers high above the earth, the first moving sidewalk that carried visitors effortlessly along the pier, the debut of cream of wheat and juicy fruit gum and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer and Aunt Jemima pancake mix and countless other products that would become staples of American consumer culture. The Court of Honor with its great white buildings reflected in the Grand Basin, its central fountain, shooting water 100 feet into the air in a display that seemed to mock the drought conditions afflicting American farms, and most miraculous of all, the electric lights, thousands upon thousands of incandescent bulbs designed by General Electric and Westinghouse, powered by massive dynamos in the machinery building, that transformed the White City into a blazing constellation visible for miles across the dark prairie, a spectacle that left visitors weeping openly, unable to process what their eyes were showing them, many having never seen electric light before, having lived their entire lives by candlelight and gaslight, believing they were witnessing something close to divine magic, something that proved humanity had finally conquered darkness itself, had finally achieved dominion over nature through technology and ingenuity. Over the next 6 months, the fair would draw those 27 million visitors, an astonishing number representing nearly half the United States population, and they came from everywhere, farmers from Iowa seeing their first elevator, immigrants from Eastern Europe discovering America through this curated fantasy, wealthy families from Boston and Philadelphia touring in their finest clothes, scientists and artists and politicians and dreamers and hucksters and criminals, all of them moving through this temporary city that promised a future of limitless technological progress married to refined classical beauty, a future where machines would free humanity from drudgery and classical architecture would provide spiritual uplift, where American industrial might would be clothed in European aesthetic refinement, but even as they marveled, even as they bought their souvenirs and rode the Ferris wheel and attended the carefully orchestrated spectacles in the various pavilions, there were truths the fair actively concealed, exclusions that revealed the deep fissures in American society that no amount of white plaster could cover. African Americans, despite making up a substantial portion of Chicago's population and despite urgent appeals from Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, and other civil rights leaders, were systematically excluded from meaningful participation in the fair, denied their own exhibition space despite repeated requests, relegated to serving roles in restaurants and as porters or presented in ethnographic displays alongside primitive peoples from around the world, their very humanity questioned by exhibitions that presented evolution as a hierarchy with white Europeans at the apex and people of color at various lower stages of development, and Wells, outraged by this calculated erasure, this deliberate attempt to erase black achievement and black presence from the celebration of American progress, published a pamphlet called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition, distributing it to fairgoers from the Haiti Building, one of the few spaces at the fair where black Americans were welcome, and exposing the hypocrisy of a celebration of American achievement that refused to acknowledge the contributions and very existence of millions of its citizens, the people who had built the nation through slavery and continued to build it through their labor despite being denied basic rights and dignity. And then there was the architecture itself, which was already becoming a source of bitter controversy among those who understood what was at stake for American culture. Louis Sullivan, who would later be called the father of the skyscraper, and whose transportation building was one of the few structures to break from the imposed classical vocabulary, looked upon the White City with growing horror as the fair opened, later writing with barely suppressed fury that the damage wrought by the World's Fair will last for half a century from its date, if not longer, because he understood with terrible clarity that this retrogressive turn toward European classicism, this wholesale rejection of the emerging American architectural voice that he and Root and others had been developing in Chicago's revolutionary tall buildings, would set American design back by generations, would train a new cohort of architects to believe that greatness could only be achieved by copying ancient Rome, that innovation was less valuable than imitation, that America's cultural destiny was to forever remain Europe's provincial outpost rather than developing its own authentic voice, and he was right. The fair launched the City Beautiful movement, and for the next 50 years, American cities would be littered with neoclassical banks and train stations and libraries and government buildings, monuments to a European past rather than expressions of American present and future, and modernist architects would spend decades trying to break free from what Sullivan had prophetically called the white cloud of the fair's influence, that suffocating blanket of conservative classicism that smothered architectural innovation and cultural authenticity. The fair officially closed on October 30, 1893, after 6 months that had seen both triumph and tragedy, spectacular attendance numbers but also financial struggles, technological marvels but also human suffering, and the dismantling was supposed to begin immediately, the temporary buildings to be torn down and the materials sold for salvage. But here's where the story turns truly dark, where the temporary nature of this dream city becomes a nightmare that would claim yet more lives. On July 10, 1893, while the fair was still operating at the height of summer, a catastrophic fire broke out in the cold storage building, a warehouse on the fairground's edge where ice was manufactured to keep food exhibits from spoiling in the heat, and despite the efforts of hundreds of firefighters from Chicago and neighboring towns, the blaze quickly spread through the wooden structure, killing 12 firemen and 3 civilians who were trapped when the building's tower collapsed. The flames, visible for miles across the flat prairie, smoke billowing over the White City like a portent of doom, like a reminder that all this beauty was built on combustible materials, that the whole fantasy could go up in flames in an instant, and that fire should have served as a warning about the flammability of these plaster and wood structures, should have prompted immediate safety measures and fire suppression systems, but nothing was done, no meaningful changes implemented, because the buildings were temporary, disposable, never meant to last beyond the 6-month run of the fair, and the fair's organizers calculated that it was cheaper to accept the fire risk than to invest in proper safety measures for structures that would soon be demolished anyway, a cost-benefit analysis that valued property over human life, efficiency over safety, profit over people. And sure enough, on January 8, 1894, just months after the fair closed and the crowds departed and the dream faded, another massive fire erupted in the deserted fairgrounds, starting in the casino building near the lakeshore and sweeping through the peristyle and music hall before jumping across to the great manufacturers building, and for 3 hours the flames raged through the court of honor, consuming in a single night what had taken 3 years and millions of dollars and untold human suffering to build, firefighters standing helpless as the plaster facades melted like wax and the wooden frames collapsed inward with thunderous crashes and the whole eastern end of the White City was reduced to blackened timbers and ash and twisted metal, and contemporary accounts describe the spectacle as both horrifying and strangely beautiful, the burning buildings casting an orange glow across the winter snow, the flames reflected in the frozen lagoons, the classical columns crumbling like the fall of Rome itself, and some observers reported feeling relief, as if the fire was purging something unclean, burning away a beautiful lie to reveal the ash beneath. More fires would follow throughout 1894, each one consuming more of the White City, and rather than rebuild or preserve what remained, rather than try to maintain this vision of beauty for future generations, the city of Chicago made a decision that speaks volumes about the fair's true nature, about what it really meant to the people who created it. They would demolish everything, systematically erase this temporary fantasy as if it had never existed, because maintaining these theatrical facades would cost more than they were worth, and besides, they were never meant to be permanent, never meant to be real, they were scenery, stage props for a 6-month performance, and once the performance ended, the sets had to be struck, and so the wrecking crews moved in with sledgehammers and crowbars, and within 18 months of the fair's closing, nearly everything was gone, dismantled or burned, the materials sold for scrap, the elaborate plasterwork broken into rubble, the White City reverting to empty parkland along the lake, and of the more than 200 structures that had stood there in all their glory just 2 years earlier, only a handful would survive into the 20th century, the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, built of more permanent materials because it was meant to house the Art Institute's collection after the fair ended. A few state buildings that had been constructed with greater durability, scattered remnants, ghosts of the great gleaming vision, fragments of a dream that had consumed so much and delivered so little of lasting value. And what of the men who built this dream, what became of them in the aftermath, in the years when the white plaster turned to dust and the promises faded and the bills came due? Daniel Burnham would go on to fame and considerable success, commissioned to create the 1909 plan of Chicago that would reshape the city according to the city beautiful principles the fair had spawned, designing grand civic spaces and wide boulevards and classical civic buildings, developing comprehensive plans for other cities including San Francisco and Manila, his reputation secure as the man who made no little plans, his maxim, make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood, becoming a rallying cry for ambitious urban planners. But his success came at John Root's expense, built on the foundation of his dead partner's genius, and Burnham would carry that ghost with him for the rest of his life, referring to Root decades later with deep emotion that bordered on grief, calling him a prince of men, unable or unwilling to fully articulate what was lost when Root died and the fair's aesthetic direction shifted away from bold innovation toward safe neoclassicism, unable to admit that perhaps the White City's greatest bankruptcy was the bankruptcy of Root's vision, the death of a more organic, more authentically American architecture that might have flourished had Root lived to champion it. George Ferris, the engineer whose will had become the fair's most iconic attraction, whose name would become synonymous with carnival rides for generations to come, fared far worse than Burnham in the years following the fair. Despite the wheel's enormous success, it earned $726,000 in ticket sales on an investment of $400,000, making it one of the few profitable elements of the exposition. Ferris became embroiled in bitter legal disputes with the fair's organizers over revenue sharing, with each side claiming the other had violated their contract, and Ferris spent the next 2 years of his life fighting in court, hemorrhaging money on legal fees while his other business ventures collapsed as the national depression deepened and credit dried up and clients disappeared, and then his personal life disintegrated when his wife Margaret left him, unable to bear his financial troubles and his obsessive focus on the lawsuits and his increasingly erratic behavior as stress and illness took their toll, and in November 1896, just 3 years after his will had made him one of the most famous engineers in America, George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. died alone in a Pittsburgh boarding house at age 37, suffering from typhoid fever and kidney failure, bankrupt, broken, embittered, his great will about to be dismantled and sold for scrap metal, moved briefly to St. Louis for another exposition before being dynamited in 1906, his personal tragedy erased from the story of his triumph. His life a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition, about how quickly fame can turn to failure, about how the same society that celebrates your genius can abandon you to die alone and broke when you're no longer useful, when the spectacle has moved on and there's no more money to be made from your innovation. The workers who built the fair fared no better than Ferris, perhaps even worse because they lacked even his brief moment of fame, their names unrecorded in any ledger, their injuries uncompensated by any insurance or employer liability, their contributions forgotten almost immediately as soon as the fair closed and they dispersed back into the anonymous masses. Those Italian plasterers who spent months coating wooden frames with staph, breathing plaster dust that would scar their lungs and shorten their lives, developing silicosis and respiratory diseases that would kill them slowly over the following years, those Irish laborers who drove pilings through frozen ground in the brutal winter of 1891–92, losing fingers to frostbite and backs to injury, those Polish carpenters who built the elaborate wooden scaffolding that held up the classical facades, falling from heights and being crushed by collapsing structures, they all faded back into Chicago's teeming working class neighborhoods on the south and west sides, many of them unemployed as the Depression worsened and construction work dried up and factories closed, some of them radicalized by the exploitation they'd experienced, joining labor unions and socialist organizations, their fury at the disparity between the fair's celebration of American prosperity and their own grinding poverty helping to fuel the labor unrest that would convulse Chicago over the next decade, culminating in violent strikes and the rise of radical labor movements that terrified the same wealthy industrialists who had financed the White City and now feared that the workers they had exploited might rise up and destroy not just plaster palaces but the whole edifice of industrial capitalism. Even the landscape that Frederick Law Olmsted created, his transformation of swamp and sand into lagoons and gardens and winding paths, would be imperfectly preserved after the fair ended, much of Jackson Park reverting to scrubland and neglect as the city's attention and resources turned elsewhere, his vision of a permanent public park accessible to all classes and serving as a democratic space for recreation and reflection largely abandoned in favor of more pressing concerns, though his influence on American landscape architecture would prove profound and lasting. His partnership with Burnham at the fair helping to establish the principle that architects and landscape architects should work together to create coherent urban spaces rather than treating buildings and landscapes as separate elements, a principle that would shape American city planning and park design for generations and remains influential even today. And what of the fair's broader legacy, its long shadow across American culture and architecture and urban planning, its ghost that still haunts us more than a century later? Louis Sullivan had been right to warn that its damage would last half a century, though even he might have underestimated its pernicious influence. The fair's overwhelming success, its ability to attract 27 million visitors and capture the national imagination despite occurring during an economic depression, convinced a generation of architects, planners, and wealthy clients that beauty and legitimacy could only be achieved through imitation of European classicism, that American cities should aspire to look like Rome or Paris rather than developing their own indigenous architectural character, that innovation was less valuable than tradition, that the future should look like the past, and this retrogressive impulse would dominate American institutional architecture until after World War II, when modernism finally broke through the classical revival and swept away the last Beaux-Arts buildings in favor of glass and steel and concrete, though even then, the damage had been done. The opportunity to develop a truly American architectural language in the 1890s and early 1900s had been lost, squandered on plaster nostalgia and European imitation, and American architecture would spend decades trying to recover from the White City's influence, trying to find an authentic voice that didn't echo Greek temples or Roman forums. The fair also established patterns of urban development that persist to this day and that we can see reflected in cities across America and around the world. The idea that cities should have grand civic centers with classical buildings arranged around ceremonial spaces, the concept of comprehensive city planning that treats the city as a unified whole rather than an organic accretion of neighborhoods, the marriage of architecture and landscape architecture into a total design, the use of World's fairs and mega-events like the Olympics as catalysts for urban transformation and as opportunities to remake cities according to grand visions, and perhaps most insidiously, the model of creating temporary spectacular environments designed for maximum visual impact rather than long-term social benefit, spaces meant to dazzle rather than serve, to perform prosperity rather than distribute it. And this model continues to shape everything from Olympic host cities that build stadiums they can't afford to maintain, to modern theme parks that prioritize spectacle over substance, to the gentrification of urban neighborhoods where authentic communities are displaced by sanitized, aestheticized versions designed for tourist consumption and real estate speculation. The exclusion of African Americans from meaningful participation in the fair also established a pattern of racial erasure in major American cultural events that would persist for decades and that we can trace forward through history. The fair's lily-white vision of American progress and civilization, its presentation of racial hierarchy as scientific fact, its relegation of Black Americans to service roles or ethnographic displays, all of this helped to codify racial hierarchies at precisely the moment when Reconstruction had failed and Jim Crow was being systematically implemented across the South and spreading to the North, and Ida B. Wells's protest pamphlet, ignored by most white fairgoers who didn't want to have their enjoyment of the spectacle spoiled by uncomfortable truths about racism and exclusion, would become a founding document of 20th-century civil rights activism, a testament to the courage required to speak truth to power, to insist on being seen and counted when the dominant culture desperately wants you to remain invisible, when your very presence threatens the comfortable myths that society tells itself about progress and equality and justice. And there's another legacy, darker still, more gothic and disturbing, connected to the fair by more than just timing and geography. While millions of visitors were marveling at the White City's beauty and attending lectures and exhibitions that promised a bright future, a young man named Herman Webster Mudgett, using the alias Dr. H. Holmes, was operating a murder castle just a few miles away in the Englewood neighborhood, a hotel he had specifically designed and built to capture, torture, and kill young women who had come to Chicago to work at the fair, to find employment in the restaurants and shops that served fairgoers, to escape small-town life and experience the excitement of the big city and the greatest spectacle the world had ever seen. And Holmes's crimes, estimated at anywhere from 9 to over 200 victims, though the true number will never be known, would be forever linked to the fair in the popular imagination and in Erik Larson's best-selling book, The Devil in the White City, which juxtaposes Burnham's creation of beauty with Holmes's creation of horror, suggesting that they are two sides of the same coin, two expressions of the same Gilded Age hubris, and that the ambition required to build a fantasy city from nothing might be related to the sociopathic ambition required to see other human beings as disposable objects, that the fair's exploitation of nameless workers and its erasure of Black Americans and its theatrical fakery all existed on the same moral spectrum as Holmes's murders, differing in degree perhaps but not fundamentally in kind, all of them examples of what happens when human beings are treated as means rather than ends, as raw materials for someone else's grand vision, as extras in a performance staged for the benefit of the wealthy and powerful. Today, walking through Jackson Park on Chicago's South Side on a quiet afternoon when the traffic noise fades and you can hear the waves from Lake Michigan, you can find scattered remnants of the 1893 fair if you know where to look and what you're looking for. The Museum of Science and Industry occupying the old Palace of Fine Arts, its exterior restored to something approximating the original grandeur, though the interior has been completely transformed, now housing not art but technology. Exhibits that would have amazed the fairgoers who first walked these halls, a small replica of Daniel Chester French's statue, the Republic, standing in the lagoon, a golden colossus meant to embody American ideals of democracy and progress but looking somehow forlorn and out of place in the modern park, dwarfed by the original 65-foot height and lacking its commanding presence, the Japanese garden, Descendant of the fair's Japanese pavilion and now called the Garden of the Phoenix, a rare surviving connection to the fair's international exhibits and a reminder that the exposition showcased not just American achievement but cultures from around the world, though often in problematic and patronizing ways that reflected the era's assumptions about racial and cultural hierarchy. And if you know where to look, if you study old maps and compare them to the current landscape, you can find the stone pillars that once marked the entrances to vanished buildings, standing like gravestones. In the grass, memorials to ambitions that exceeded their maker's grasp, to dreams that consumed their dreamers, to a moment when America tried to conjure paradise from plaster and instead created a cautionary tale about the cost of spectacle, the price of exclusion, the bankruptcy that comes from valuing appearance over substance, fantasy over reality, European imitation over American innovation. The fair's influence on American culture extends far beyond architecture and urban planning, seeping into consumer culture and entertainment and even the way we think about progress and technology. It established the model for modern world's fairs, though none would ever again achieve the same cultural impact or capture the public imagination in quite the same way, the form becoming increasingly irrelevant as technology made it possible to experience distant places and cultures without traveling to a centralized exposition. It introduced Americans to exotic foreign cuisines and to the hamburger and the hot dog as quintessential fair foods that would become staples of American eating. It showcased early motion pictures and recorded sound, giving many Americans their first exposure to technologies that would transform entertainment and communication. It demonstrated the potential of electricity to transform every aspect of daily life, from lighting to power to communication. Making electric light and electric streetcars and electric appliances seem not just possible but inevitable, it popularized the idea of the amusement park through the Midway Plaisance, which featured carnival rides and exotic villages and entertainment that would inspire places like Coney Island and later Disneyland, and it created the template for Disney's theme parks, which Walt Disney explicitly modeled on World's Fair pavilions, on the idea of creating immersive environments that transport visitors to other times and places. And in doing so, it helped create our modern experience economy, where spectacle and consumption are seamlessly fused, where authentic places and cultures are replaced by sanitized, commercialized versions designed for easy consumption by tourists who want experience without risk or discomfort, where everything is designed to be Instagrammable rather than meaningful, where surfaces matter more than depths, where performance trumps reality. The question that haunts the White City, the question that Daniel Burnham and John Root and George Ferris and the nameless workers and the excluded African Americans might ask us if they could speak from beyond the grave, if they could see what became of their dreams and their suffering and their exclusion, is this: what did we actually build, and for whom, and at what cost, and what did it really mean? Was the White City a vision of a better future or a nostalgic fantasy of a past that never actually existed? Was it an inspiration towards civic beauty and urban planning or a retreat from the challenges of creating genuinely democratic public spaces that serve all citizens rather than just the wealthy elite? Did it represent American aspiration at its finest or American exploitation and exclusion at its most calculated and cruel? And perhaps most troubling for us today, in our contemporary moment when cities still host mega-events that displace residents and create spectacular temporary environments while leaving behind little of lasting value for ordinary people, when architecture still too often serves the ego of the architect and the prestige of the patron rather than the needs of the community and the users of the space, when we still erase the labor and sacrifice of workers in our celebration of great achievements and great men, when we still build monuments to progress that actively exclude huge portions of the population based on race and class and immigration status, have we learned anything at all from the cautionary tale of the 1893 White City, or are we doomed to keep building beautiful temporary fantasies on foundations of exploitation and erasure, to keep making the same mistakes over and over, to keep sacrificing substance for spectacle, inclusion for exclusion, reality for fantasy, the many for the few? The fair's bankruptcy wasn't primarily financial. The exposition ultimately broke roughly even, its massive construction costs and operating expenses covered by the equally massive ticket sales from those 27 million visitors, but rather moral and creative and spiritual. It bankrupted a certain kind of architectural courage, replacing the innovation that Root and Sullivan represented with the safe imitation that Burnham's classical revival embraced. It bankrupted the idea that American culture could develop organically from American soil and American experience rather than being imported wholesale from Europe and imposed from above by educated elites. It bankrupted the lives and health of countless workers whose names we'll never know, whose suffering we can only imagine, whose injuries and deaths were deemed acceptable costs for creating a 6-month spectacle. It bankrupted George Ferris, turning triumph into tragedy in just 3 years, leaving him to die alone and broke despite having created one of the most iconic structures in American history. And it bankrupted John Root's vision, cutting short his life just as his most ambitious project was beginning, replacing his dream of an organic, distinctly American architecture with Daniel Burnham's safer, more conservative classical revival, and in doing so, it may have cost us 50 years of architectural innovation and cultural development, exactly as Louis Sullivan predicted with bitter prescience. Those decades when American architects could have been developing new forms and new approaches and new ways of thinking about buildings and cities instead of slavishly copying ancient Greece and Rome, instead of looking backward to Europe rather than forward to an authentically American future. But perhaps the fair's greatest bankruptcy, the one that still haunts us today, the one we still haven't fully addressed or acknowledged, was imaginative and moral. It convinced generations of Americans that beauty, progress, and civilization could only look one way: white, classical, European, ordered, monumental, hierarchical, and in doing so, it impoverished our collective imagination, making it harder to see beauty in other forms, in the organic architecture that Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright would develop despite the fair's influence, in the vernacular traditions of immigrant communities and indigenous peoples, in the possibility that progress might mean something other than order imposed from above by enlightened elites and consumed by grateful masses, that civilization might be measured not by the grandeur of temporary palaces but by the quality of ordinary daily life for ordinary people, that a truly democratic architecture would be accessible, functional, honest about its materials and purposes rather than hiding cheap wood and plaster beneath a theatrical coating of false marble, honest about its costs rather than erasing the workers who built it, honest about its exclusions rather than pretending to represent all of America while systematically excluding huge portions of the population. And so the White City dissolves in memory like those plaster facades dissolved in the flames of the 1894 fires, melting away like snow in spring, leaving behind only fragments, scattered remnants, ghosts and echoes, and a lesson we still haven't fully learned, a warning we still haven't truly heeded, that the most seductive visions are often the most dangerous, that beauty purchased at the expense of truth and justice is a devil's bargain that will come due eventually, that temporary fantasies can have permanent consequences that outlast the fantasies themselves, that exclusion and exploitation don't become acceptable just because they're draped in classical architecture and bathed in electric light and celebrated by millions of visitors, and that the real measure of any great public work, any grand civic project, any ambitious architectural undertaking, is not how it makes the powerful feel or how impressive it looks in photographs or how many tourists it attracts or how much prestige it brings to the city, but what it actually does for the powerless, for the workers who build it and the communities who live around it, for the people who are excluded from it and the people who can't afford to experience it, whether it makes ordinary life more dignified and humane for ordinary people or whether it merely creates a spectacle for the wealthy and powerful while extracting resources and labor and sacrifice from everyone else, and by that measure, the only measure that really matters, the glorious White City of 1893. For all its undeniable beauty and technological marvels, for all the wonder it inspired in those 27 million visitors, for all its influence on American architecture and urban planning and popular culture, must ultimately be judged a magnificent failure, a cautionary tale about ambition without wisdom, vision without compassion, progress that leaves too many people behind, a city built on sand and plaster and the broken bodies of immigrant workers, designed to last 6 months and to dazzle millions. Achieving both those modest goals while failing the larger test of creating something genuinely worthwhile, genuinely democratic, genuinely worthy of the tremendous human cost it demanded, and that failure echoes still through American cities, through our continued obsession with spectacular civic projects that serve tourists and prestige rather than residents and community. Through our ongoing willingness to sacrifice workers and exclude marginalized communities in service of grand visions that benefit primarily those who already have power and wealth and influence, through our inability Or unwillingness to imagine public beauty that doesn't involve monumentality and massive expense and debt that future generations will have to pay, through our persistent belief that Europe represents civilization and culture while everywhere else represents something less refined, something less worthy of celebration and preservation, through the simple fact that more than a century after the White City burned and was bulldozed into rubble, we're still building temporary fantasies instead of permanent communities, still prioritizing spectacle over substance and surface over depth, still forgetting the names of the people who actually do the building and the suffering while celebrating the names of the men who merely dream and direct and take credit, still learning the wrong lessons from history when we bother to learn anything at all, or worse, learning no lessons whatsoever, condemned to repeat the same mistakes over and over, to keep building our white cities on foundations of exclusion and exploitation, to keep bankrupting lives and spirits in pursuit of visions that benefit the few at the expense of the many, to keep choosing fantasy over reality, spectacle over service, monuments over community, and in doing so, to keep failing the most basic test of civilization, which is simply this: do we treat all human beings as ends in themselves, as people whose lives and dignity and humanity matter, or do we treat them as means to someone else's ends, as raw materials for grand visions, as extras in spectacles staged for other people's benefit, as disposable labor to be used up and forgotten, and until we learn to answer that question correctly, until we learn to build cities and societies that serve everyone rather than just the powerful few, the ghost of the White City will continue to haunt us, its white cloud will continue to cast its shadow, and its bankruptcy, moral, creative, spiritual, will remain our bankruptcy, our failure, our cautionary tale about what happens when we choose beautiful lies over uncomfortable truths, when we choose exclusion over inclusion, when we choose the temporary dazzle of plaster palaces over the permanent work of building genuine community and genuine justice and genuine democracy.